Welcome to the United launch. This is a book really around bridging the data divide to eradicate human trafficking. For those of you I have not had the privilege to meet, I am Brittany Dunn. I am one of the co-founders and CEO of Safe House Project, and I'm joined today by my co-author, and I'll let him introduce himself.
Well, it's certainly a pleasure to be here with you all and really to talk about this second book that was spun off of the first one that we did together, Eradicating Human Trafficking. And so really exciting to be able just to share, to be able to expand upon some of the original stuff that we wrote about in the first book. My name is Bill Wolf. I am the managing partner at the Wolf Group and have been in the anti-trafficking space for about 20 years now in various different roles in law enforcement, federal government service, nonprofit service. And so really excited just to be with you all today to continue to talk about this as we see the human trafficking field continuing to evolve. I see some of my colleagues, some of my more senior colleagues in the chat here, and just, we've seen such great growth over the past 20 years and really excited on this new stage, this new era, this new season that we're going into, particularly around data. So excited to have the conversation, excited to be able to be with Brittany today and to have had the honor to write a second book with her.
Awesome. Well, thank you. Alrighty, so we're just going to dive in. For those who didn't know even that a first book existed, that really was around collective impact. And one of the things that Bill and I really worked to draw out in that is not just where has the anti-trafficking field been, but also where do we need to go? And a lot of that was around the 3 Ps that everybody knows, but also policy and partnership. Those are at the really heart of what we see as the next phase of the movement, is how do we strengthen those ties and make sure that we as all of our stakeholders, law enforcement, policymakers, survivor leaders, NGOs, and community members, everybody really know that they have a seat at the table. And how do we really constructively dialogue around a very complex issue? And what came out of so many of these conversations was that data is so necessary to helping drive decision making. And so that's really a part of where this book kind of went from. One of the other things that we also have heard from so many different partners throughout the field is that we really need to move from having insights around data to showing how we can impact change. So when we leverage the power of data collection ethically, and we're going to go into that more in depth, it really positions us to do a few key things. We really want to be able to identify effective interventions, and that's across all of those different Ps. We want to guide the development of trauma-informed practices, making sure that we are using evidence-based and promising practices in all areas of the work in order to really help strengthen how we serve survivors well. Inform resource allocation. I think everybody knows that resource constraints are real in this space, and that is a reality that everybody feels every single day. So with limited resources, how do we as individual organizations, as individuals within our organizations, but also more importantly as the collective, make informed decisions around how to utilize the limited resources? Revealing gaps in service provision. I think we all know that where the gaps may exist in our maybe own organization or locally or even nationally, but how do we address those gaps really has to be informed by data decision making. The next piece is aiding in investigations and prosecutions. We know that obviously that human trafficking is a criminal enterprise. And so to eradicate it, we can't just rely on addressing the protection of survivors. We also have to make sure that we are going towards the prosecution of traffickers and buyers. Then demonstrating impact to funders and stakeholders. We all have a responsibility to those who invest in the work to steward those those donations and those investments well. And so how do we demonstrate impact back? Not just maybe reflective of what our own organization can do, but where we're seeing a lot of success is also in how groups are coming together to strategize around funding models that that filter through that collective impact model, allowing for organizations to go in and receive funding as a collective. And then enhancing collaboration among stakeholders. Obviously, everybody has their own area of responsibility and their own mission that they align to. But where data can really lend is helping drive collective vision and aligning milestones and outcomes to kind of cross organizational collaboration.
And I think this is really where we've seen, the field has evolved over those 20 years, right? Where when some of us first got started, we were just kind of guessing, and we were always and have continued to always try to answer that age-old question of prevalence, right? How prevalent is this? How many cases of human trafficking? But I think our thinking and our approach to this has really evolved to say, listen, we don't I think we can collectively agree we may never get to that prevalence number, at least in an accurate way. But there is a lot of data out there that can really be collected and leveraged to make really informed decisions. I know from my investigative days, some of the data that I've seen just produced over the past 12 months by organizations like Safe House Project would have been invaluable in understanding how trafficking operations are working. During my service with the federal government, being able to really identify like where those gaps are. I think those of us that have been in the space for quite some time, we may experience it or we may experience it not even realize that sometimes within the arena of human trafficking, there gets this level of exhaustion, right? We see that particularly around private donors and things like that, where we kind of built our argument on stories, and that's important, right? But at some point, we want to see impact, right? Like Brittany was talking about. We want to see what are we actually doing to move the needle. And to be able to show that impact, we've got to be able to shift how we tell that story to using data. And what is the data telling us about what's actually happening? So this is a really exciting time. I remember it was probably about 5, 6 years ago, maybe a couple longer than that. I participated in a work group that was led by Department of Homeland Security. And in that work group, we were looking at different data sets that were out there relative to human trafficking. And one of the things that we found is that nobody was collecting data in a uniformed way. And so the problem became is that what one organization was reporting was we had no idea where that overlapped or didn't overlap with other organizations. And so there's really a lot of disparity in the space. And so those insights became a little skewed, right? We weren't really sure what that data was actually telling us at the time because technology's evolved, because the field has evolved, because you all as professionals really have such a stronger understanding of what human trafficking really looks like. We're getting so much better that we can start to move into that impact space. So this is just really exciting for us, and particularly for my colleagues that, we've been in this space for such a long time.
Awesome. So as we kind of go into this, we kind of maybe a little bit stepping back for a moment. So about I don't know, 3 years ago, our team, having reviewed so many different grant applications from those seeking funding from our grant application process, started to just really recognize that, to Bill's point, there was a lot of different ways that data was being collected, and it was really hard to understand always how that data, how it made sense, honestly, in the larger arguments. A lot of things were inconsistent, or maybe the definition by which the data was being collected really didn't allow for comparison over different organizations. And so that led to a lot of conversations around, well, what are the terms that really should guide certain data collection efforts? And so we're going to get there. But I think what we also want to make sure is that at the core of our foundation, knowing that human trafficking is an issue where we are working with an extremely vulnerable population and those with really hard lived experiences, that even in data collection, there has to be a foundation of ethical considerations. And so I really encourage you to think about your individual organization and what practices are put in place for ethical data collection. The pillars that we really align to are do no harm. We want to make sure that any data that's being collected, that there's a purpose to it, that we aren't collecting data for data's sake, and knowing that we also have an obligation, first and foremost, to survivors of human trafficking, that their personal autonomy and agency is protected. So there is consent in that. There is that they get to choose, obviously, how their information is used. So that goes to do no harm, but it also goes to that informed consent. I think that sometimes this idea of informed consent also gets a little bit murky with people who maybe haven't read the bigger definitions. Informed consent really is about stating how the data will be used, what is their options for providing information, and then the option to not provide information. So it's really breaking it down into its pieces. And then that goes even further when we're talking about anything that's HIPAA compliant or things along those lines. And so getting to informed consent also means that we need to be making the language that we use when kind of reflecting how data will be used very clear, not using too much legalese in these considerations, and really stating up front how that information will be used. Then we look at confidentiality. We want to make sure that people know that their data is protected. And so that means that, in order to share information, you have to have releases of information. You have to have, non-disclosure agreements and all of those kind of legal protections to make sure that people feel safe in that. And then cultural sensitivity. Data collection needs to not only be accessible by those who may speak English, but also what are the opportunities for those who don't, that English is a second language for them, or they don't speak English, or maybe we have somebody who is hard of hearing. Just making different access points is also an important consideration when we think about just that ethical data collection.
And I think this is, one note here is that this is an ongoing conversation, right? So in the book, we tried to outline considerations, things that we need to be thinking about, but understanding this is not a finite conversation, right? This will continue to evolve as we learn more, as we start to collect data in a more meaningful way and leverage that for different policy decisions, the way that we collect the data, et cetera. And so this is why it's also important that we really encourage you all as professionals, as stakeholders, as interested parties to be able to engage in these conversations, within this framework of, do not harm, informed consent, confidentiality, and cultural sensitivity. What does that mean for you in your programs or in your space in which you're working? What are things that, flagging where there might be certain challenges? And then, of course, how do we overcome those challenges? Because we're going to continue to run into them year over year. And I think, Brittany really highlighted something too, and that is making sure that we're staying up to date with our understanding of what some of these different concepts are, like informed consent, right? It's something that can be confusing, or sometimes we take word of mouth, right? It becomes the telephone game as to what some of these terms mean. And so I think, again, it's really important for us to make a concerted effort to understand, but also to think about how we apply within our spaces.
So some of the considerations for how you think about what data should be collected as you will go into data collection is really that it is smart data. So specific, measurable, action-oriented, relevant, and time-bound. And I think that, just having those in mind when you're thinking about that data points need to be well-defined, that we do need to have like normalized data sets. The data is action-oriented. This is one that I really believe in, because if we're collecting data just to have a data point, and we're not using that to inform how we're going to strengthen service provision, how we're going to improve outcomes for survivors, whatever that is, then why are we collecting and storing information that is around somebody's usually lived experience if it isn't going to help inform a action that benefits the population? Relevant, data collected really should tie to clearly stated goals. And so what you're measuring may change over time. And so it is important to think about, what data you have collected historically and whether that's still relevant to where your organization is today. And then time bound, looking at those regular intervals, tracking progress, changes over time. Data is a guide, but it definitely doesn't tell the whole story. And so when we look at it in time-bound increments, we're able to see more of those longitudinal analysis. We're able to see where there's trends and patterns and things that are shifting. And that is actually where the bigger stories can be told, is when we are looking at things and breaking it into these segments and then seeing those shifts as we continue to move as a field or as an individual organization.
And I think we're starting to see that, I think there's going to be some data that's going to start coming out from leading organizations that really paint a picture that maybe some of us knew, but we didn't have the data to back it. Or I think some of it's going to start to break down some things that may be misconceptions in the space, particularly around service provision, what works, what doesn't work. And so this is just a really exciting time for us to just kind of be able to look at how things can become more effective overall, right? Service provision, investigations, resource allocation, all of these things are going to be much more data driven that will really allow for more effective approaches to addressing human trafficking.
So I think these are some of the questions that you can ask yourself. This is by absolutely no means comprehensive in all the questions that we need to be asking when we go into thinking around data collection. But what data is most relevant to improving survivor support services? Thinking through very practically, what are those metrics that, if measured properly, are going to help inform your programming, strengthen your program, identify gaps in your programming? So much of this is not just about finding the impact numbers that we can give to donors. What really should be guiding our data analysis is, where are the challenges that we're seeing within the solutions that allow for us to strengthen our response? Because we all know they're there. We just have to be very intentional about identifying them and responding to them. What can realistically and consistently be collected given the organization's resources? Not every organization is called to collect robust amounts of information. So you do need to consider, what are your team resource constraints? What are your personal constraints in data collection? And I think that also allows you to get down to a more effective number of data points that you feel like you can manage. Giving your goals and your purpose, what data metrics will be used to evaluate impact, success, failure. I think that one of the things that we really seek to do when we, mentor and walk alongside organizations, whether that's through Safe House certification or other programs, is help them identify, like, what are those standout metrics that are really going to be helpful in guiding the baseline for the organization. But then where can we see in those failure points opportunities to put intentional tracking or, data collection in place so that we can start to understand what are the challenges that somebody might be facing and that will inform better solutions. How can the data collection process protect privacy while protecting autonomy? This goes back to that informed consent. Another piece is that, when you're cross-sharing data, even with an ROI, consider what needs to be shared versus what you have permission to share, even beyond and then what needs to be shared. There might be more redaction that can happen, or really de-identifying the data holistically in order to get to a point where you can analyze it while not tracing it back to an individual lived experience. And so I think, really taking into consideration how we take look at our data, even internally, like not all staff necessarily has to have all of the information of the individual in order to see the data in a more holistic way. Are there legal or ethical restrictions on what types of data that can be gathered? That is going to vary sometimes by state or by locale or by region, but part of it is doing your due diligence to know what is ethical and using your own legal counsel to determine that, and making sure that you have the policies and procedures in place for that data collection. And then it always goes back to that consent piece. And how the last piece here is, how do you ensure that data is accurate, secure, and high quality? Data isn't about just adjusting it. It's about looking at it, making sure that there aren't anomalies in it, that the data is cleaned before analysis, and different things along those lines to make sure that we're really analyzing data with a high level of integrity so as not to misconstrue results.
I think this also, and I'm jumping ahead a little bit, right? This is something we're going to present here shortly, but I think it goes to this concept of universality, right? So the more that we can align, so all of these are important questions for us to be asking around, what are we collecting? How are we collecting it? But also thinking about, how do we then present that information, right? To make sure that we are using the same terminology, that when we and I'm going to go really high level, right? But I could remember, 10, 15 years ago, we would convene these roundtables, these working groups, and they'd be like a 4-hour working group. And the first 2 hours we would spend debating the definition of human trafficking, right? And so I think, we're at a point now where we can move beyond sort of debating over terminology and align around, again, sort of giving away a little bit of what we're going to talk about in a minute, and that's a dictionary of terminology, right? But I think it's important for us because that is, in my opinion, that's kind of the central call to action of this book, right? Is for us to align around certain definitions, around what data we are collecting, and then how we're actually collecting it.
Perfect. The other really important thing that we do that I encourage everybody to think about from how you're currently doing it and where do you want to be is strength-based interpretations. I think it's easy to trend toward negatives and we fail to highlight survivor resilience. So in our communication of the data, how can we really see those patterns that reflect survivor resilience? We have opportunities in here to identify those protective factors. We know there's a lot of risk factors out there. We absolutely need to know what those are as well. But what are the protective factors? If we can start to integrate those into prevention curriculum and talk about protective factors, we can also change narratives and help inform the positive side of the issue as well. And then positive framing and recommendations, we don't do anything without having our lived experience experts at the table from the point of creating the initial evaluations through interpretation, because data without the lens of the lived experience honestly shouldn't even be considered. It is so critical to have that, not just the quantitative information, but that qualitative experience there to make sure that we're putting on the right lens when we're reviewing that information. And so through that, that also allows for us to draw out what are those strong recommendations that really go towards survivor empowerment as we look at the outcomes of a data collection.
I think you covered that well.
Perfect. Okay, and then there's multiple tiers in which recommendations can come through. So, there's individual level recommendations, which focus on how services can directly impact survivors. That might be that, there might be some data that you're collecting, and the outcome of that data collection may be for the sole purpose of improving one person's experience in care. And that's amazing. We should be doing that. We should be caring deeply about the one and how their experience through service provision needs to be tailored to them. But then as we build those different data sets, we can also see those programmatic level recommendations. Where can we improve effectiveness, accessibility of services? How has the population that maybe you're serving transitioned over time as different trends have emerged in the field? Constant reevaluation of programming through the lens of current service provision and current needs of participant allow us to make sure that we don't atrophy as a field and fall into just kind of this rhythm of these are the only things we provide and fail to realize that maybe there are new considerations that are coming out as deep needs for our survivor community as this issue continues to evolve. I think where that's extremely visible is in the fact that, we believe identification rates are at approximately 1%. So that means there are huge underserved populations that aren't even represented in our data sets yet. And so if we assume that the data that we have today is really representative of the big picture, then we are missing that there are entire populations whose needs aren't even being considered at this moment. So this will allow us, if we continue to remain teachable and really allow us to continue to evolve, we're going to be more effective in, I'm not saying overhaul every single program. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying, but continue to iterate and make sure that we're thinking about our solutions critically to meet the demand. And then the last one is systemic and policy level recommendations. And this is where it really comes into collective impact, because when we overlay maybe our individual organizations' data sets, and outcomes or insights with that of different stakeholders in our, in our sphere of influence, we're able to paint a better, more comprehensive picture that really can help inform policy decisions, both at the, local, state, and federal level. It can help drive change to different agencies, and it may strengthen how, if you're more in the service provision category of running a safe house program for survivors, having that information from the partners to your left and your right, your law enforcement partners or your referral pipelines, is really critical to making sure that you're ready to serve those that they might be identifying. And so working as a collective will just help strengthen our overall approach.
I think, this is really where we get into, and to Brittany's point, like we're not having to eliminate systems or eliminate programs, right? But it's an opportunity to build upon it. One of the programs that I think of in particular is the Department of Justice's Enhanced Collaborative Model Task Force program. And that program has been around for many, many years. And there's been certain challenges that I think have been unable to fully navigate making that program better or enhancing that program in a way that can overcome those challenges because we haven't had the data yet. And we're starting to see that really exciting that actually Safe House Project is working on an enhanced collaborative model task force program alongside law enforcement partners. And already we're seeing where some of the data coming in is able to help better informed landscape analyses, is better to inform response systems so that we're not duplicating efforts. And then we're really starting to see like where those gaps are. Historically, we've kind of guessed, right? We've said, well, we don't think this exists, right? But now that we're starting to aggregate data, do analysis, we're actually being able to pinpoint exactly where those problems are.
Perfect. Then when it comes down to communicating your message, it's tailoring that message to the audience. And so we know that there are, practical insights that come away for service providers, for our survivor community, for policymakers, and survivors is listed on there twice, which is should say funders. But how do we make sure that, we are utilizing the information and the insights derived from data collection in a way that goes back to those ethical considerations? I think, always passing it through that filter of ethical data collection and ethical communication, just make sure that we're protecting those that we serve. And so a huge part of this for us is just being transparent in our communication. How do we make sure that it is clear, concise, and consumable for those that we are communicating with?
And I think this is, it's sort of this shift, right? Like I mentioned before in how we're doing our storytelling, aside from just the one-offs, like this is what happened. Now we can start to tell a streamlined story. I know Brittany jokes that we do a lot of training together, particularly for law enforcement, and she knows all of my stories now from my old cases as a detective, right? This is a way for us to start to streamline some of that process, right? And to be able to show those very real insights from the different groups that we're working with. I also think it's incredibly important. Like we focus a lot on, policymakers and survivors and service providers, but that last one should be funders, right? Like that is critically important because we know that financial resources are becoming more and more limited, and the funders are demanding, that's a strong word, right? But to some extent are really, wanting to see the data of what is actually happening in the space and what the impact is, right? And so one of the things that's really exciting too is to see other organizations like Safe House Project that can share some of their data with other organizations so that they also can better make their case for what they need. And so again, I think this also, not only is it a collaborative process in collection and analysis, but it's also collaborative in resource allocation because now we're sharing the data to tell that same universal story.
Perfect. So then it kind of comes down to that confidentiality and anonymity, especially as we are communicating. We want to make sure that we are de-identifying, any of the information that is used in any reports. I think that the field really has learned that pseudonyms are a more appropriate way to protect identity, especially for those who may want to have their story or information provided, but not necessarily tie it back to them. But more importantly, I think it comes down to the power of that aggregated data source to really show collectively this is what is happening, and this is where we as a field are currently at, and then tell the story of where, we as individual organizations or as a collective or nationally want to be driving toward. Using trauma-informed language and how we communicate goes beyond just being trauma-informed, but being survivor-centered, making sure that, as I've said, that the lived experience experts who are have that seat at the table through this entire process are the final review and kind of stamp on that this can go external because it's passed through their lens, and making sure that it's really focusing on that survivor resilience, strengths, recovery, things along that line. Informed consent, we've talked about a few times, and then responsible media engagement. Just how do we talk about our work comes back to, as Bill's mentioned, using the data to help position the work within the broader landscape and the broader argument, but then also, using the survivor-centered stories to help paint a picture of both that quantitative and qualitative experience.
And this is a level of accountability for us in the space, right? We hear that so often. Other organizations will, be critical of how others might be presenting information or presenting stories or approaching it. And so I think like when we apply these concepts through the lens of data, that it does present or provide that level of accountability within the space for each other, which I think, and I'll be the one to say it, oftentimes we're our own worst enemy in the anti-trafficking space. There's a lot of unnecessary squabbling. And I think that as we start to lean more on the hard facts, the hard data, we can start to eliminate some of that as well, which again leads to my favorite word of collaboration, right? It creates environments where we're able to work together, because it does start to break down some of those barriers when we're making assumptions or presumptions about certain things.
Okay, so now getting to really kind of the core of what we've been working on. So we convened a working group for the past year and a half to put together a standardizing data collection data dictionary. It's really as exciting as it sounds, but hopefully you'll find it to be a really great resource, because what we were seeing is that there were so many definitions. You ask somebody how many referrals they've had, and one person might tell you how many times their phone rang versus another might be doing it based on the number of intake applications they've received. And somebody else might be doing it for the entire length of their organization, whereas one might be doing it for a year. And so just the lack of clarity and transparency around certain data has allowed for a lot of, I think, miscommunication, misinformation to enter in. And I think it's also where we've seen historically, and I think it's improving, is a little bit of the sensationalism of our issue. And the challenge is when we see the issue being sensationalized or data being really overstated, then those organizations who are maybe, running a safe house program that serves can serve 5 survivors in residential care at any given moment, are going, how do my numbers even stack up to these really huge things? And we need to be able to frame the conversation within where are people at, within where's their unique niche within the space, and then what is the realistic data that surrounds that type of model, and then how does that fit into that larger narrative? And when we are more clear and transparent around that, and actually stating our outcomes in a way that really reflects what has happened in a time bound, following those SMART goals, then it really will allow for kind of the true essence of the incredible work that everybody is doing every single day to come through. So the data dictionary is a living document. This is not something that we're putting out there going, this has a rubber stamp of approval on it. It is something that, we had about 20 different people wrestling for a year and a half with these definitions, trying to come to some level of a standardized version based on what we were seeing across hundreds of organizations' use of different terms. And so the way that the dictionary is broken down, and this is, you can download it off of our website, is we have different classifications for the data points. And then you can see like two examples where we're pulling out a definition, how that data should be collected, allowed values, usage guidelines, what is the data source for that, logging requirements, an example, and version control. Because as you all submit in with maybe new definitions or revisions to definitions, that version control will allow you to know when was it last updated, so that collectively we can start to systematically collect things in the same way. I think the other benefit of the data dictionary is, especially as new organizations are entering the field, how can we make sure that they're not just defining their own definitions that established programs have spent years kind of getting to a standard format? And we can bring people along faster. We can decrease those learning curves if we are all kind of moving in the same direction in how we look at the data.
And like I mentioned before, like I really think this is the central call to action, right? Like this is the for all of us to get on board with this and to say, okay, we're going to agree because it is again, I'll be the, sort of the abrasive one in the room and say, this is a real opportunity for us to put, our actions or what is it like our money where our mouth is or whatever that saying is. But like we talk all the time about collaborating. We talk all the time about setting aside our egos and things like that. Here's a real opportunity to do something in a way that is truly beneficial to ourselves, to our programs, but also to the field as a whole, to say, listen, like we're going to get on board with being able to present data and information in a universal way so that we can be much more effective in understanding the problem. And so this is just really, really exciting for me. It gets over the 2-hour conversation about let's define human trafficking because now we have a definition of all of these different components. This is also something that can be very much a living document, right? It is a living document in which will continue to grow as we learn more around the different terms and ways that we need to define things. But it really eliminates duplicity as well.
So a lot of the terms, it's not limited to just those that are in the protection space running safe house programs, although those are the examples that I've used today. It really has terminology in there that align to the collective impact framework that we outlined in the first book, across all of the 5 Ps. We have to have standardization of definitions across protection, prosecution, prevention, policy, and partnership. And those are the things that are going to drive collective impact, because when we're all speaking the same language and operating from a shared set of data points and knowing that there is transparency and collaboration and communication embedded in how that is collected, that it's done ethically, it's done with survivors at the table, and that stakeholders are coming together, it really strengthens just the overall position of our field within the even larger landscape of issues that, people are looking at every single day, trying to determine how to invest, state and federal dollars, how to invest their time and their talent. Like this goes beyond just looking at us as an individual anti-human trafficking field, and really allows us to show a unified front and a collaborative front to the larger world.
And I just, I love this eradication framework. We talked about it in the first book. We use it to guide a lot of the work that we continue to do. And really pointing out, as Brittany mentioned, right, we have terms for all these different components within the wheel. But sort of in that lower right-hand corner, that technology infrastructure layer, we finally have the technology to be able to make this accessible, right? Like this is something that can live online. It's something that we can easily share and then use technology to be able to collect as well. So really, really exciting times like in the evolution of technology as we go into these different spaces relative to data.
Yeah, and I'm going to actually address one question that came up in the chat around just how to use it effectively. The nice thing about a data dictionary is that it's from that you as an individual organization can make your own code book. So you can look through the 200 pages that it is and determine these are the subset of data points that we as an organization are going to collect. And then if you are working alongside other stakeholders in the space, whether that's through a task force or through a coalition, whatever that might look like, then they would have their code book of terms. Well, there may be some terms that everybody is collecting, and those are your overlap points. But collectively, you can kind of segment it. And then if there's cultural considerations or local considerations, it's just agreeing on that. So this really is a starting point for people to create those code books that align to how their local or regional, area of responsibility is operating. So one of the other pieces that we go into through the book is a little bit around, okay, so what is the so what? Like, yes, there's huge benefits, obviously, as an individual organization to being able to collect data and then communicate it out effectively to our donors or to improve our individual programming. But where the real power in the long-term, opportunity lies as a field is as these data points start to all be standardized across so many different systems, there's going to be better interoperability. With increased interoperability, obviously guided by all of the foundational things we've talked about around consent and legal agreements and MOUs and all of that, what that leads us to is being able to start to really inform strategies across all of the different areas. And so the interoperability is something that we have all, I think, really felt that the lack of it has created silos of data, which means that a lot of things don't inform each other. And so we're all operating with missing pieces of our puzzle right now. But if we can move towards standardization, then we're going to be able to link arms more effectively.
And I think this really highlights, the survivor care, right? The survivor is at the center of all of this, right? And so we talk about interoperability, and we can also apply that to a continuum of care. Just had a conversation this morning around, whether or not a state had adopted a unified continuum of care. And I think this is something we're going to hear more and more about, right? And that is what does that actually look like? How do we define the services that we're providing and at what time during that restorative care journey? And I think the more that we are aligning our language, the more that we're defining things the same way, the more that we're creating a universal continuum of care, the better we're going to be able to serve survivors, right? That's the protection component of it all. It also supports prosecutions, right? Because we know that when we're able to ensure that survivors have access to care, that it actually enhances the criminal justice process and the ability for law enforcement to do their job effectively and hold offenders accountable. But also, this is going to really inform prevention, right? In a way that we've never been able to do before, to really understand where are those intersection points that we can come in and put different intervention models that work and honestly get rid of some of the ones that don't work. So this is really, really exciting.
So we've touched on it a bit, but just really to say that the benefit case for everybody when we move towards standardization, collective impact, collaboration, is that we are going to have data-informed approaches, and that is going to strengthen everybody's outcomes. It is going to help inform so many pieces of our work and really see a more unified approach. It's going to improve resource allocation and utilization, because it isn't just that there's a limited amount of resources. We also want to be utilizing the right resource at the right time for the right purpose to see the most effective outcome. All of us want to see a survivor connected with the resource that they need when they need it most, not having to hop through 7 different systems before they end up in the place where they feel supported and ready to be served. Feedback loops. These are really important. We definitely need to build feedback loops into how we do data collection. We need that feedback from stakeholders, from survivors, from donors, from our policymakers to make sure that there's a constant state of improvement. Data collection is a is constantly improving. We always have to be in a spirit of teachability and making sure that we are continuing to evolve with the systems. And then cross-system collaboration. We've talked about it very heavily within our field, but there's so much opportunity to then come alongside corporate partnerships or other systems, healthcare, things like that, that will then just continue to strengthen and harden the overall effectiveness of the field. So some of the protection outcomes that come through improved data collection would be increased identification for earlier intervention. Greater identification would mean greater diversity in service needs, allowing us to create benefit cases for different models. We all know there's no one size fits all model for survivor care. And so we need a wide variety of models at the table, but knowing which ones are needed in which communities at which time is going to be driven by data. We can also, focus in on what are the specialized services needed for different victim populations. Victimology drives a lot of which care techniques need to be deployed. And so knowing those things goes back to more of that individualized care model of meeting every single survivor who comes in for services effectively for where they're at. And then obviously the survivor feedback, making sure that survivor leaders are guiding these conversations and that lived experience is being brought to that analysis. From the prosecution outcomes, I'll let you do these ones, Bill.
So, like we kind of mentioned that when we're leveraging data to better provide for survivor care, we know that we're enhancing the criminal justice process, right? Because the survivor is more likely to be able to engage in that criminal justice process or be able to disclose information, et cetera. But we also can look at law enforcement's really shifted to a data-driven approach, really trying to understand, really predictive analytics is huge within the law enforcement space right now. But we haven't necessarily had the data to be predictive on where trafficking is happening, to understand different trafficking patterns because the data has been so disparate, even among law enforcement agencies. Now that we're able to start collecting these different pieces, we're going to be able to increase identification because we're going to uncover some of those undetected criminal networks, right? By understanding their methodologies, where they're operating, maybe it's geographically, but also where are they operating, online, et cetera. Brittany and I have had conversations with several different technology-based companies that are deploying new technologies that are collecting data and information on just a massive scale, right? And then thinking about how we can then leverage that and get it into the hands of law enforcement in a way that it makes sense. I think one thing that's really important that I kind of garnered from my law enforcement days, and I always like to kind of share with folks is, yes, law enforcement's job is to interdict and respond to crime, but they're constantly being asked to do more and more with less and less resources, right? Crime and criminal networks are becoming more and more complex as they leverage technology in new ways. So we have to make sure that we're supporting our law enforcement partners in being able to get that information, to be able to and not even just giving them the raw data, right? Because it's massive. I've been out of law enforcement for I think 10 years now. I remember back when we would just take a cell phone, right? And we would do a forensic analysis of a cell phone. The amount of data, it would typically produce about 1,000-page report, right? That we would then have to comb through. That was 10 years ago. Imagine how much data and how thick those reports are now, when it comes to this type of stuff. And so being able to take this to not only inform investigations, but Nicole, I'm going to go to your point and say to also to provide training for law enforcement on advanced investigative techniques so that it doesn't have to be so invasive. We can shift away from the old school of kicking in doors or even doing, ill-informed sting-based operations to really leveraging technology and leveraging that data to be much more trauma-informed in our approach and be more effective in identifying those networks. More cases generate better intelligence gathering, exposing vulnerabilities in trafficking operations. And so again, we can start to test that, right? We can start to see, because we know that while no one trafficking operation is the same, there are lots of similarities among them, right? And so data is going to be able to clarify that a lot more for us. It increases witness availability, strengthens prosecution capacity, as well as case building. And it starts to give us that pattern recognition across multiple cases to really be able to enhance prosecutorial approaches, targeting network vulnerabilities, and allowing us to leverage those predictive analytics in a much more effective way.
Awesome. And then I think, prevention, we all wish that we could start with prevention so that we didn't even have this issue. But at the end of the day, prevention is very hard. Prevention curriculums, prevention solutions are very hard to arrive at if we don't have the information on how the crime is being committed, on the vulnerabilities and on the trends and things. And so the data actually that's coming out of prosecution and protection is vital to informing effective prevention solutions. And so that really is the ultimate goal, is where we can use all of the data points and insights and being drawn out to create more culturally sensitive prevention models, to target our prevention models to certain, populations, and know that they're going to vary by geographic location. And so this is really the part that I think in the long term should excite all of us, is that when we choose to lock arms and collaborate and see collective impact, it really is going to move us closer to that ultimate end state of being able to prevent trafficking before it starts. So when it comes to the benefits of real-time data sharing and case for continuity, we've gone over a lot of these, so I'm not going to spend too much time because I want to get to a few of the questions, at least in the chat. But, what we're really seeing is that there are a lot of organizations that are doing incredible work, and they're collecting incredible data. And so there is now just the opportunity for us all to help standardize that, to help, create those relationships at a local or state or regional level, and see those models continue to strengthen for each individual locale, and seeing different groups do that really well and continue to model that for other places who might be just at the beginning of considering these. And so I think it's through that we're just wanting to help hopefully provide a resource that will allow for better conversations around it and drive hopefully some enhanced collaboration in the field. So this is one of the quotes from the book. It is the culmination of efforts, small and large, that will tip the balance. Every time data is collected accurately, shared securely, or analyzed thoughtfully, it is one step closer to dismantling trafficking networks and protecting vulnerable populations. This collective momentum is what will drive lasting change. And so really, as Bill said, we encourage you to download the dictionary. We encourage you to figure out how this can be a resource for you and your organization, or you and your task force coalition. But more than anything, we just want to see this field united. We want to see collaboration lead the way. We believe that, it's through collective impact that we will see the end of trafficking in our lifetime, but that we have to start somewhere. So this is us saying, let's start somewhere and work together to strengthen even the data dictionary and improve that so that we can really come together in a meaningful way. Okay, so there's a link to the book. And then there's also, we'll send out a link to the website as well, where the data dictionary can be downloaded. But looking at the chat, we will have a time for our Q&A, hopefully for a question or two. Monica asked, is it legal or ethical for donors or grant providers to ask specific info from survivors, for example, their gender, or if they contact them for verification? Legal, maybe. Ethical, probably not, especially on the contacting them for verification. But there are a lot of applications that ask for the gender. That one isn't surprising. And there's some organizations will say they decline to state or they don't collect that information, but that one's legal. That one is legal and ethical. But the contacting somebody for verification, I have not seen that happen, or should be happening. Have you, Bill?
I have not. And I'm looking someone asked for the link to the book. I'm looking to pop it in the chat here. Hold on one second.
Perfect. If you haven't been collecting data, where is a good place to start? I would start with reviewing the data dictionary and finding the terms that align to what your organization is already doing, and just standardizing that operation. And data collection can start with Google Forms. It doesn't have to be really scary and robust. In the book, we outline different forms of data collection at all varying levels of complexity. To give you an idea of just how to do that, the biggest thing is if you're collecting data that has personally identifiable information, is to make sure that that is secured and that it isn't open just to anybody on, within your organization. And then, the consent piece is critical as well. So those are some of the things to start, but we've really tried to break apart the book where the first third really talks about organizational data collection. The middle is around how do we start to think about it from a stakeholder relationship locally, and then what is the big picture of where we can go collectively as a field. Okay, and then let's see, one more. Survivor with lived experience, and I occasionally collaborate with smaller survivor-led organizations. How can larger, more established organizations begin to not only include these smaller groups in broader data initiatives, but also help guide and support them in building capacity for meaningful and sustainable data collection? I think it's absolutely necessary that organizations who have access to larger data sets are continually sharing the insights and outcomes back to the field, especially their partners, to strengthen, grant applications, to support business cases, and to help grow that collective impact. And so I think, it's about setting those MOUs, setting those NDAs, getting the legal protections in place, but then locking arms for impact. And so I do think that there's absolutely a place for making sure that organizations can do this well together. Okay, we will download the rest of the Q&A, and then when we send out the recap, we will work to answer these questions as well. So we appreciate your time today. Thank you for joining us, and we hope you guys have a great day.